was the town tramp, but I didn't know what that meant. This woman had the yellow peroxide hair, she had the red nails, the red lipstick, the beautiful eyes, the high heels, short skirt, and I thought she was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen. And whoever I was with said, oh, she ain't nothing but trash.
There is a photograph that has been circulating online for years, one that most casual fans of Dolly Parton have scrolled past 100 times without knowing the full story behind it. In the image, a young Dolly stands beside a quieter, more reserved woman, the two of them grinning like they share a secret the rest of the world isn't in on. That woman is Judy Ogle, and for nearly 70 years, she was the one constant in Dolly Parton's extraordinary life. When news broke on August 25, 2026, that Dolly Parton had died at the age of 80 after a brief and largely private battle with cancer, the world mourned a music legend. But for one woman in Tennessee, the loss was something far more personal. She wasn't losing a star. She was losing the person who had known her since before either of them had a single reason to be famous. This is the story of that friendship, one that outlasted marriages, fame, illness, and decades of speculation. And it's the story of what has happened to Judy Ogle in the days since her best friend's death. To understand why Judy Ogle's silence matters so much right now, you have to go back to the beginning, long before Rhinestones, long before Nashville, long before anyone outside of Sevierville, Tennessee had ever heard the name Dolly Parton. Dolly was born into a family of 12 children, raised in a one-room cabin with more mouths to feed than the land could really support. It was in that setting, surrounded by mountains and poverty and music that filled in the gaps where money couldn't, that she crossed paths with a local girl named Judy Ogle. The two were children when they met, and from nearly the first meeting, something clicked between them that neither girl could have explained at the time. They weren't alike in temperament. Dolly was loud, magnetic, always the center of whatever room she was in, even as a child. Judy was the opposite, watchful, steady, more comfortable observing than performing. But that contrast seemed to be exactly what made the friendship work. Where Dolly needed an audience, Judy offered something rarer, someone who simply paid attention without needing anything in return. Their families knew each other, which was not unusual in a town as small as Sevierville, but the bond between the two girls grew into something that went well beyond a typical childhood friendship. By the time they were teenagers, they were inseparable, the kind of pair who show up together so often that people stop being surprised to see one without immediately asking where the other one is. Dolly would later describe those years in her own writing as some of the most carefree of her life, full of small-town adventures that felt enormous at the time. It was during this period that the foundation of their friendship was set, a foundation built not on fame or convenience but on simply having grown up inside each other's lives. What often gets left out of the story is that Judy Ogle had her own path to walk before she became known publicly as Dolly Parton's closest friend. As Dolly's career started to take its first uncertain steps toward Nashville, Judy's life moved in a different direction entirely. She joined the military, a decision driven partly by practical necessity. Her family, like Dolly's, wasn't wealthy, and the structure, income, and benefits the service offered were not small considerations for a young woman from the mountains. While Dolly was chasing a music career with no guarantees attached to it, Judy was learning discipline, structure, and independence in a completely different environment. It's a detail that tends to get flattened in the retellings, the idea that Judy Ogle existed only in orbit around Dolly Parton, when in reality she spent years building a life of her own, dating, working, and figuring out who she was outside of any friendship. That separation, as it turned out, was never permanent. Once Judy's time in the military ended, she made her way to Nashville, and the two friends picked up almost exactly where they had left off, as though the years apart had simply been a pause rather than an ending. By that point, Dolly's career was gaining real traction. She had begun appearing on television, building a name for herself in an industry that chewed up far more hopefuls than it ever made stars of. And as the demands on her time and attention multiplied, it was Judy who slid naturally into the role of the one person Dolly could fully trust. Not a fan, not an employee in the traditional sense, but someone who had known her before any of this started and clearly wasn't going anywhere because of it. Over the years that followed, Judy Ogle became something that doesn't have a clean job title. She worked as Dolly's assistant, yes, but she was also, at various points, present for hair, wardrobe, and the countless behind-the-scenes tasks that keep a touring performer's life from falling apart. More than any specific duty, though, Judy became the person who managed the parts of Dolly's life that fame tends to strip away from its biggest names: normalcy, honesty, and someone who wasn't impressed by any of it. Dolly has spoken publicly, more than once, about how disorienting extreme fame can be, how it becomes difficult to know who actually likes you versus who likes what you can do for them. Judy Ogle solved that problem simply by existing. There was no version of Judy that needed to be won over. She had already decided, decades earlier, back when Dolly had nothing to offer but friendship, that she was in. There are stories from those years that Dolly herself chose to tell in her own memoir, stories that capture the particular flavor of their friendship better than any general description could. One of the most memorable involves a trip the two women took to New York City sometime in the 1960s. Back when Dolly's television appearances hadn't yet reached audiences on the East Coast, meaning she could walk down a Manhattan sidewalk without being stopped every few feet. For two young women, raised in rural Tennessee, the city represented a kind of freedom neither of them had access to.